Yahoo family, it's the general. And this time we're going to do something way different. We got the Raccoon Club versus Lion Larry Elder. And I'm going to be honest, I'm kind of disappointed in y'all family. Y'all let this old 102-year-old dude get up here with these CNN facts and act like he was really talking about something. I mean, and a lot of you station channels, whatever y'all call yourself, On Point and Anton Daniels, On Point called the Queen Mammy of the Year. That's impossible because Oprah's still alive. Not to mention, she probably had the most information in the room. They just wouldn't let her talk. But that's all right, Queen. We're going to ride out for you today. Let's get this party started.
I bring a lot of issues to the table that I feel our side is not talking enough about, if at all. For example, the number one social problem in America, by far, is the epidemic not of COVID, but of fatherlessness. And the stats are clear. Even Barack Obama once cited them. If you're raised without a dad, you're 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. What's happened? In the mid-'60s, with I think the best of intentions, a Democrat named Lyndon Johnson launched what he called the War on Poverty. And since then, we have incentivized women to marry the government and incentivized men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility.
Get over here! All right, Lion Larry. Other than being 102, I'm not sure why you use the 60s as a reference point for your argument, but I appreciate it. So we're going to talk about the destruction of the nuclear family, and we're going to pinpoint the 60s. And then we're going to pinpoint Lyndon B. Johnson, one of the only presidents who ever even tried to do a little something for us, as the core problem. So we're going to completely overlook the implant named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who single-handedly destroyed black economics almost overnight with his civil rights movement. And he even admitted at the end of his career that he felt like he led his people into a burning building. Now, he only admitted that after he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize from the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. But that's beside the point. And we're going to completely overlook, in the 60s, the Nation of Islam was re-implementing core values into young black men and work ethic. The CIA infiltrated, pulled them apart, and destroyed both of the leaders. And we're going to completely ignore the fact that the director of the CIA, J. Edgar Hoover, said in his fiscal 1969 annual report, the increased activity of violence-prone black extremist groups had put more investigative responsibilities on the FBI. Hoover said the Black Panther Party, without question, represents the greatest threat to internal security of the country, even though we were in the middle of the Vietnam War. Yeah, okay, Larry.
Let me ask you a question. What do white people do wrong, Larry Elder?
What do you mean, what do white people do? I'm not worried about white people. I'm worried about what's going on with us.
But if there's systemic racism in this country, which we know it is.
No, I don't say there is. You say there is. I don't believe that.
Oh, you don't believe there's
No, there
systemic
used to
racism?
be, obviously.
Right? You look at the schools in our community. Some of our schools are the worst, right? Would you agree with that? Yes or no?
Absolutely. Don't you think it's wise for us to talk about the epidemic of fatherlessness, the lie that America remains systemic racism, systemically racist, and the need for school choice? 13 public high schools in Baltimore, 0% of the kids can do math at grade level. Are you kidding me? 53 public high schools in Chicago, 0% of the kids can do math at grade level. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party is opposed to school choice.
Get over here! Mr. Larry Elder. You are definitely something else. You know, my granny used to say you's a lie and the truth ain't in you. Now, I don't know if the truth is in you or not, but you definitely ain't fond of it. So let's start here. You cannot argue that there's no such thing as systematic racism, and then 5 minutes later, agree to systematic racism. And then 10, 15 minutes later, use systematic racism trying to prove your point. You see, when you talk about how horrible the test scores are in two of the biggest black cities in America, that would imply systematic racism. See, let me prove it. You keep hollering about something called school choice. Well, what is school choice? School choice simply means that students will not be bound by their district and address, meaning that they could just go to school anywhere, unlike how it is now, meaning whatever district you're in, which meaning whichever district you're in is what school you go to, which makes it a lot easier to racially profile neighborhoods and areas. So if this wasn't a factor, then your little school choice concept wouldn't matter because there would be equal education no matter where you go. But the fact that you're fighting for school choice means that some schools in some districts are not doing things fairly. You see how easy that was?
Mr. Elder, a quick question. Let's just remove the word racism, since that seems to be a word that triggers, a conversation down the water hole. Let's just focus on the word system.
Okay.
You mentioned that the system was the one that discouraged. And again, we have no problem with agreeing that the family, the black family, should certainly has some room for some improvement. But let's just focus on system.
Room for
You said that the
improvement?
system. Well, we're not going to go down that water. We're
Okay.
not going to go down that water hole. Let's get to the question. So the question is, you said that the system encouraged black women to be single mothers, correct?
I said the welfare state, yes.
The welfare, the system. So who's in
Okay.
charge of the system? Who was in charge of the system?
Well, it was Democrats that passed it.
And who were
The-
Democrats? Were they black or white at that time?
Well, at the time, majority of black people were Democrats, as the majority of black people are Democrats now.
Not the voters. I'm talking about the system. Remember, the main idea is the word system. Who was in charge of the system at the time? The Democrats at the time, the system. I'm just going to Charlamagne's point about white or black. Was it white Democrats in charge of the system or black Democrats in charge of the system?
Well, if you're prepared to say that Lyndon Johnson did this viciously with an intent to destroy the black family, I disagree. He did it with the best of intentions.
I didn't ask you that.
And if you look at the New York Times, which is left wing, the Washington Post, which is left wing, they cheered all of this.
Right. And what I'm asking was it white people? So I'm going to ask again in case my mic's not coming through clearly. Was it white people in charge of the system or black people in charge of that system that helped break down the black family? It's a simple yes, just a simple question, white or black.
Tell me what you think the number one systemic example of systemic racism is in America.
Oh man, there's so many.
Just give me the most important one you think.
But at the top of mind, I'll probably maybe say mass incarceration. Maybe.
Really? During the Great Depression, when 50% of black adults were unemployed, you didn't have this kind of mass incarceration. It's the breakdown of the family.
Get over here! Larry. It's amazing how you want to continue to talk about the destruction of the black family, but you don't want to deal with any of the real issues. So how about this? How about we get out of the 1960s and try something more current, like, I don't know, maybe the 90s? That could work. In 1996, the CIA, admittingly, with the knowledge of the United States President and the Attorney General, manufactured and then distributed crack cocaine into the inner cities of America. And now, prior to that, 3 years earlier, something called CCA, or now Core Civic, was created. This is the private prison complex, who then had something called the Secret Meeting in Hip Hop, where business moguls from all over the country sat down with the top record executives and decided to go into the private prison business with a guaranteed 90% turnover ratio. And how were they going to guarantee a 90% turnover ratio? Through using what's called gangster rap. So we were targeted on multiple facets by the United States government intentionally. And Mr. Elders wants to talk about what?
So what do white people do wrong? I'm gonna keep asking you that because I want.
Well,
like, do
well,
they
you,
do,
it,
do they
seems,
do anything wrong?
it seems to me rather than deal with what's going on, the pathology that's going on in the inner city, you want to blame. You want me to talk about how bad white people are,
No, I'm
which
saying
I don't, which I don't think is
that there's a cause and effect.
which I don't think is a particularly productive thing to do.
Well, I think
No,
I'm
no,
talking.
no.
I think there's a cause and effect, but if we can't talk about the cause, which I believe is systemic racism and white supremacy, the FBI says.
Well, I just told you, if it's systemic racism, please explain to me how it was when America really had systemic racism in 1940. 87% of blacks lived under the poverty line. Again, this is during Jim Crow era. My father is from Athens, Georgia, grew up in Jim Crow. My mom is from Huntsville, Alabama, grew up in Jim Crow. 87% of blacks live below the poverty line. This is before Brown versus Board of Education. You did not find these kind of black on black crime.
Probably because we had no
But
choice.
they still were living below the poverty line, though, sir.
I'm sorry?
You're forgetting the fact that they were still living below the poverty line. You're picking and choosing, saying this was good, but this was bad.
Okay.
The bottom line, they end between the poverty line. But let's move forward
Well,
on system.
can I just address that? In 1940, 87% of blacks lived under the poverty line. 1960, that number had fallen to 47%. That's a 40-point drop in 20 years. That's the greatest 20-year period of economic expansion for black people in the history of America. Again, well before Brown versus Board of Education, well before the KKK imploded, well before we had race-based preferences. Why? Because it was rare for a black kid to be raised in a family without a father in the home. A strong belief in Judeo-Christian values, a belief in patriotism, even as America wasn't applying these values to black people, obviously.
Get over here!
The only thing that's obvious to me is that Larry lied a lot. Did you just reference between the 40s and the 60s as one of the best times in Black American history? Of course the black family was still together. It was pre-integration. It was either stay in the house or you could get lynched. And Judeo-Christian, are we just going to pretend that Christianity was not almost single-handedly responsible for the transatlantic slave trade? And patriotism. Is this the same patriotism that had the police sicking dogs on us and spraying us with water hose? Because if we were so in love with America and patriotic, it probably wouldn't have been no need for the entire civil rights movement. This entire interview, I was wrecking my brain trying to figure out what's wrong with this guy, and then he said it.
So that Ronald Reagan, my favorite president, when he entered the Oval Office.
What the hell did you just say?
Okay, one more time.
Ronald Reagan, my favorite president.
Are we talking about the same Ronald Reagan that was part of the Iran-Contra scandal that manufactured and distributed crack cocaine to Black America throughout the 80s and 90s? And your argument is there's no such thing as systematic racism and the destruction of the nuclear family. Well, your favorite president helped us out with both of those.
Finish him!
And my final message is to the Raccoon Club. If you're going to have politicians and political sidewinders on your platform, do yourself a favor and be a lot more informed. Because Black fathers are the most involved fathers in America by a whopping 70%.